So it's important to emphasize the relationship between Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah has been rocky over the years. There's a long-standing relationship, but when the Syrian uprising started in 2011, Hamas sided with the Syrian opposition, and of course Hezbollah and Iran sided with the Syrian regime. So they fell out, and Hamas pivoted towards Egypt, where of course at that stage the Muslim Brotherhood had won the elections and under President Morsi. But then when Morsi was toppled by the Egyptian military, that then sort of started a gradual process of Hamas finding its way back into the Iran-led axis of resistance. And certainly by the end of the 2010s, they were fully back in, and with funding and with sort of coordination. But I think it's very important to emphasize also that according to Hamas leaders, as well as Hezbollah leaders, Hezbollah did not know of the attacks beforehand. And this makes sense from a tactical point of view, because if you want to keep an attack like that out of sight from the Israeli intelligence, which has ears everywhere in Gaza, but also in Lebanon, you want to keep the details of that tactic to a very small circle. So sharing it with other groups increases the risk of that. So in terms of a tactical analysis, that makes sense that they didn't share that information, and same with Iran. And it's also important to emphasize that when the Israelis looked at all the weapons that were found on the Israeli side of the border of Gaza, they confirmed that there were no obvious Iranian components there. So clearly this was not something that Iran had a direct hand in. And also, when people talk about support from Iran to Hamas, they overlook that Hamas has built up its own capacity within Gaza. They have their own design of rockets, which are homemade, very kind of simple to make in your garage, so you don't need a kind of a big factory. And that is, I think, also important, that it's a very local manufacture of these weapons. So in terms of Hamas's strategy, this is slightly complicated to think about it at the moment, because on the one hand you can say they've succeeded in stopping the normalization drive in the region. It's very interesting that Saudi Arabia, which 3 weeks ago was talking about normalization with Israel, immediately after the attack they came out with a statement blaming Israel for the violence and saying we told you over and over again that if you do not solve the blockade and do not agree to a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, there's going to be more violence. And it led to the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, making his first phone call to the president of Iran, having had a standoff for over a decade with Iran, to talk about the Palestinian state and the importance of putting that back on the agenda. So in that sense, you can say that they were successful on that particular target. Of course, how long this mood will last, that we'll have to see. I think they've also been successful in putting the Palestinian state and the Palestinian question back on the map. I mean, everybody's talking about it. There are huge protests worldwide in the region, but also, for example, here in London, people saying that they want the Palestinian state to be there. So they've kind of changed that narrative. And I think the other thing where they already have succeeded is, and I think it's important to think about it from a Gazan perspective. If you've been locked in an open-air prison for 16 years, the symbolism of Hamas fighters breaking out of that prison, flying over the fence and then bulldozing the fence, that is enormously powerful for Gaza and for Palestinians more generally. So that in that sense, I think Hamas has rekindled the idea that they've punctured the myth of invincibility of Israel on its own soil, and rekindled the idea of an armed resistance. So in terms of Hamas's strategy for Gaza, this is more complicated, because the way they attacked Israel, they sort of invaded Israeli territory and killed Israelis on Israeli soil. They would have expected a harsh response from Israel. And also a harsh response from the international community, where the international community would sort of side with Israel and not really put any pressure on Israel to rein itself in. So what then does that mean in terms of their long-term thinking about Gaza? Is it, I mean, in terms of their own organization, are they expecting to survive? Israel has said that they want to eradicate Hamas. From a historical point of view, it's very unlikely that Israel will succeed in this. If you look at history, when governments have tried to uproot armed non-state actors with grassroots support, who are sort of indigenous, they have not on the whole succeeded, unless there was a full-scale genocide. And if Israel does that, that is going to be shocking. So it is possible that Hamas has calculated that although the Israeli response will be harsh, that they will be able to ground the Israeli ground offensive to a halt through their urban fighting, the tunnels, the way they have prepared Gaza for a ground offensive, and that the number of Israeli soldiers that will inevitably die in that assault, and also the number of Gazan civilians becomes so high that the Israeli army will have pressure to stop, but also that the international community will put pressure on Israel to stop, which then might mean that there is still enough of Hamas left to be in control of Gaza. So that might be their logic, but either way, it would mean a high loss of civilian lives, and in that sense, this is difficult to comprehend, because Hamas would have known that they would be responsible for that. But what's interesting, if you look historically, every time Hamas and Israel have fought, and Israel has bombed Gaza, afterwards there has been an increase in popular support for Gaza because of the anger at what Israel has done to Gaza and Gazan civilians. Because when Israel fights, hundreds, if not thousands of civilians are killed, and that then also strengthens Hamas's claim that it's the only actor that is standing up to Israel. It's very important to talk about the motivations, and in some ways this links back to the clash you had at UN yesterday between the Secretary General and the Israeli ambassador, where the UN Secretary General said this attack didn't come out of nowhere, and I think you have to see it in at least three different contexts. One is that Hamas in Gaza has always been trying to show solidarity with what was happening in the West Bank, and also to show leadership of the Palestinian movement. And before the attack on October 7, during this year alone, over 230 Palestinians had been killed in the West Bank. There have been over 1,000 attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians. So the West Bank has been going through a very difficult period. Then there have been the threats to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which of course is the third holiest site in Islam. And that's always one of the trigger points for Hamas. And I think what's also important there is to realize that in terms of popular opinion, if you look at polls in the last year, support for armed struggle, for return to an armed intifada among West Bankers has gone up from 40% to about 54%. So there's a big shift. And so one way to understand this is Hamas showing solidarity, claiming leadership, but then also trying to trigger protest or even an uprising in the West Bank. Then the other thing is within Gaza itself, that Gaza, of course, has been under a blockade for 16 years. And if you look at what Hamas has tried to do to end that blockade, there's been more limited wars in 2012 and 2014, for example, which were explicitly about ending the blockade and forcing Israel to open up the borders. That didn't help. Then Hamas has made various political overtures. They've negotiated with Fatah and National Unity Government with only technocrats that are affiliated sort of loosely with Hamas. So there were no Hamas members there, so the international community could possibly accept that government. That didn't happen. They issued a new manifesto in which they specifically said that they would accept a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, in which they also said, because they have their own hardliners to keep on board, that they didn't recognize Israel and they didn't give up the right to claim to the Palestinian historical land. But it was nevertheless an important overture. None of that led anywhere. And so you can see that particularly in the last few years, the hardliners within Hamas have gained the upper hand over the pragmatists, because these other ways of trying to solve the blockade didn't help. And I think part of it is also that Gaza, which is only 1% of historic British mandate Palestine. So it's a very small enclave. They are. There's a fear of just being forgotten. That they're there. There's a status quo. It's an open-air prison camp, and nobody cares what happens to them. So there was also sort of, in some ways, saying the status quo is not tenable. There will be a cost to Israel if they want to maintain that. And so I think also the extremity of the violence has to be seen in terms of the violence that Gazans have experienced over the last 16 years. Where you have, just as a very important statistic, that for every Israeli civilian killed, about 20 Palestinian civilians were killed, most of those in Gaza. So that, I think, is the second reason. The third reason is the regional situation, combined with what happens in Israel itself, where you have the most right-wing government in Israeli history, talks of annexation of the West Bank, and then regionally normalization agreements with a number of Arab states, and with Saudi Arabia being rumored to be next. So this is also this can be seen as an attempt to stop the Palestinian question and the Palestinian state idea from just disappearing altogether. And there was a real fear that would happen as well. Judging by history, it's unlikely that Hamas will be eradicated. It's likely that there will be a part of Hamas left. There will also, I mean, the ideology and sort of the idea of Hamas will be left. So even if Hamas itself gets destroyed, it's likely that there will be another organization like it in the future, which will be probably more radicalized as a result of the enormous number of deaths now. I mean, it's important to underline that. As of today, the number is 7,000 people have died in Gaza. That is more than the number of people that have died in the whole of Palestine that have died between 2008 and 2023. So in 2 weeks, more people have been killed than in 15 years. So it is likely that whatever comes after may have a more radical view. But I think so that means if there is some form of Hamas left, and it's before the war, it enjoyed popular support in Gaza. It had about 45% of support from people who were polled in a poll in September. That means that the international community and Israel will have to somehow deal with Hamas politically. And if you look at former heads of Israeli intelligence, former military generals, have all gone on record to say there is no military solution to this conflict, and certainly not to the Gaza blockade. There has to be a political solution, and that means that there have to be some kind of negotiations. And this is where I think the international community, buying into the Israeli narrative that Hamas is no longer a political player and that it needs to be eradicated, which is only possible through a full-scale genocide, is very counterproductive and unhelpful and unethical. Again, looking historically, every war on Gaza over the last 16 years has ended through negotiations with Hamas. So Israel negotiating indirectly, mostly through Egypt, a ceasefire. All the hostages that Hamas has taken in the past, they have been through the negotiations indirectly, again, with international actors, sometimes Germans and others. So in that sense, Hamas has kind of expertise and a history of negotiating, as does Israel with Hamas, even if indirectly. And I think if you look at the way the hostages have been released recently, in the first case, it clearly seemed to be the case that Qatar had been involved. So this suggests that some of the political leadership that are in Qatar have some influence over the military leadership. And I think that's an important fact, because as far as we know, the political leadership wasn't aware of the attack, or at least of the details of the attack beforehand. So this was a military leadership campaign. And so the danger would have been if the political leadership had been completely sidelined, then there would be nobody to talk to, none of the pragmatists that I talked about earlier. So as long as there are still pragmatists within Hamas, there is a possibility to come to negotiate. And I think the only way to end this cycle of violence is to not use labels like terrorism, the things they've done, which are horrendous, but to look at the root cause of why Hamas is there, why there is this kind of violence against blockades, against 75 years of occupation and displacement and ethnic cleansing and all the things that have happened over the last 75 years. And that means coming to some kind of a just and equal solution, which to me it still looks like the two-state solution is the best way forward, and that's something that Hamas has, at least that parts of Hamas have signed up to. It's something that Fatah has signed up to, and this is the kind of the if you look at polls, it has a high support from the Palestinian population. This is where the international community needs to step up and actually put pressure on Israel to seriously consider a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, which will be costly for the Israeli government. But that also is, in my eyes, the only way that you would come to a situation where you don't have these cycles of violence that reoccur. And I think here that the Arab states might play an important role. Now that they've sided again with the Palestinian state idea and pushing that forward, they might also be able to put pressure on the Americans, on the EU, to put pressure on Israel. And I think the final thing to bear in mind here is that since the Palestinians have signed up to the International Criminal Court, what happens in Gaza is part of the jurisdiction of that court. And so rather than label one group terrorists and stress the other group's right to self-defense, which means that there's a completely unequal power balance, is to take both groups in front of the International Criminal Court and let the court decide who has committed the war crimes and what punishment that should be given. That also means that you keep a political option open, because the moment you start to use the terrorism label, it means that you can't negotiate with people because that would be against the law, and that means you depoliticize the conflicts. It becomes the only kind of solution then becomes bombing and war, rather than finding a negotiated way out.